There's no replacement for displacement. How many times have you heard that? I know I've heard it a lot. And it is somewhat important, but there's another thing I want to talk about in this video that's equally, if not more important, and that's flow. So what is an engine? An engine is basically just an air pump. We get air coming in through the intake, into the combustion chamber, and then pushed out the exhaust. The more air that can be sucked into the engine and pushed out of the exhaust equals more power. Recently, a channel called New Guy's Garage uploaded a video where he showed the difference between the intake and exhaust ports of 3 different cylinder heads. He had one that was an aftermarket high-performance head that flowed really well. Then he had 2 that were stock heads with stock castings. He showed the difference between the intake ports and the exhaust ports and how they were shaped different, and how the aftermarket one was a whole lot smoother and didn't have any weird angles for the air to move around. I highly recommend you go watch that video. He did a really good job. Another big contributor to flow efficiency is the design of the intake and the exhaust system on the engine. So this has to do with intake and exhaust ports, either on the engine block in this case or in a cylinder head, and also has to do with the design of the intake and the exhaust manifolds. This is why when people want to make more horsepower with their engines, they'll put a bigger carburetor on it, they'll put different exhaust on it, maybe bigger or better flowing, so that the air moves better and more efficiently through the engine. For example, this is a 218 cubic inch flathead 6-cylinder engine. Now you notice that the exhaust and intake valves are actually in the block on this engine. They're not in the cylinder head like a more modern engine. This engine is from the 1940s, and this is generally how they did it back then. And the exhaust and intake manifolds would bolt onto the side of the engine here. Now, the flow on this engine is not very efficient. First, imagine we have our intake manifold here and our carburetor on top. The air would have to go in the carburetor, down into the intake manifold, and then have to take a 90-degree turn over this way into the intake port, then another 90-degree turn up through the intake valve, then another 90-degree turn over and down into the combustion chamber. Once the explosion happened, the piston goes down. Once the exhaust stroke is coming up, that exhaust gas would then have to come up, take a 90-degree turn into the exhaust port, 90-degree turn down, and then out this way into the exhaust manifold, and then another 90-degree down out the exhaust. There's a lot of turns in this. Now, there are more fine details as well, like the actual port size and the casting, how clean the casting is and that sort of thing. That makes a huge difference. But this engine in general, even if you had the most perfect polished and perfect sized ports, this engine isn't going to make a whole lot of power. This engine from the factory was advertised to have 95 horsepower. Here in the Mustang, we've got a 200 cubic inch inline 6 engine with overhead valves. Now this engine does still have the intake and the exhaust on the same side, just like the flathead did, but this engine flows better. Instead of having to go sideways and then up and then over and then down and then up and then over and out, this engine goes in through the carburetor, and it has kind of a slope like this down through the intake port into the combustion chamber, and then the exhaust path kind of has another slope out like this and then out the exhaust. So even though this engine has 18 less cubic inches of displacement, this engine makes 25 more horsepower, at least from the factory. Okay, and then here in the F250, this has a 400 cubic inch V8. Now this is not stock, as you can tell. I have an aftermarket intake, carburetor, and exhaust on this engine. So this actually makes a lot more horsepower than stock. And this is another good example because these 400s, they had a bunch of emission stuff on them, and they were meant to be a low horsepower, high torque workhorse engine. So they came with really low deck cast iron intakes and 2-barrel carburetors. This, I couldn't find an exact number, but I'm pretty sure from the factory these were about 150, 160 horsepower. In 1978, that is. So this engine, twice the displacement as the one in the Mustang, but because of all the restrictive intake and restrictive exhaust, this engine only made 25, 35 more horsepower. Now the flow on this engine is even a little bit better than the last one, because we have the intake on one side of the cylinder head and the exhaust on the other side of the cylinder head. So, especially with this aftermarket intake, you can see that it's pretty tall, and so we have a pretty direct path down into our intake port, goes down into the combustion chamber. Then the exhaust just has to come up like this and flow out the exhaust that way. So as you can see, the design of the engine or the design of the cylinder head is really important here. If the air has a more direct, less impeded path from intake to exhaust, it's going to be easier to make power. Now this engine behind me that I've got taken apart is an old abandoned Chrysler engine that I found in my garage. Every Sunday I've been live streaming taking this thing apart, and my goal is to rebuild this engine without spending any money on parts. So if that's something that's interesting to you, go ahead and check out the live stream on Sunday. It's at 3 p.m. Mountain Time every single Sunday. There will be a full-length video eventually once I'm done with it. And thanks for watching. Go check out New Guy's Garage video. I'll put a link to that somewhere. And yeah, subscribe and thumbs up and stuff. And then, yeah, let me know if you like this sort of video or not. And thanks for watching.